Good afternoon. Today we'll be looking at the self, me, and you, various social psychological constructs as it relates to in-groups and out-groups. This presentation is brought to you by Travis Goodson, and it's made specifically for Liberty University. Our agenda for today is as follows. We're going to be talking about a variety of topics, all related to the realm of social psychology. What is the self? What is me? What is you? What is us as a collective, and who are we as a society and human beings in different populations? We're then going to move into a time where two questions will be posed. Feel free to answer those, followed up by a reference section for everything cited in the entire presentation. Providing a brief introduction to the following constructs, we look at the realm of social psychology as a whole, and we evaluate the different constructs and theoretical orientations that brought us to the development of these different issues we're going to be focusing on today. As social psychologists continue to focus on the social self, they advance the entire field in exploring how self-esteem, in-group affiliation, and stereotypes shape one's view of their own self-construct. Answering questions of how social identity manifests itself in our musical choices, current research being conducted in that area, how activism is viewed by the general population, and how salience toward outgroups dictates our subconscious has truly revolutionized the entire field of psychology. Central to all the research being conducted through this vein of social psychology is the construct of the self-concept. The self-concept is defined further by Cass and Fien and Marcus as the sum total of beliefs that people have about themselves, how they view themselves, what incorporates their own attributional biases and their own prejudices towards themselves and others, how they view society. It's a very complex matrix that informs individuals about themselves and how we learn about our own behaviors and the behaviors of others. Defining how the self-concept interfaces with these identified issues and what the current literature supports leads to further defining the self and a better understanding of the social self in general. If we can better understand ourselves, then maybe we can have some greater solutions to the potential problems we face as an entire society. In addition to a greater understanding, we use the data, as those that study social science, from the self-concept to pioneer potential research in areas that have problems that need to be solved across the world. Current research being conducted on the social self in relation to the identified questions posed will be elaborated in the different constructs already brought up. So what is the self? It is, as defined, the sum total of the beliefs people have about themselves, how they view themselves, and how they view others. There are many different psychological theories that compose the view of the self, but what we're going to be looking at specifically in terms of the self and the self-concept is how it breaks down into different constructs based on other psychological theories. Let's move into what is me. Me is the self-awareness we have as individuals that makes up our self-concept. One of the subcomponents of that is self-esteem. That was further defined by Cass and Fien and Marcus as a valuative component of the self in general. So it's not just a specific item, but more likely a general evaluative state that we see ourselves in. It's temporary. Self-esteem in this medium may be described as a temporary formation of how one positively or negatively views themselves in light of their current social condition. However, it does play a part in affecting a more permanent construct of the self-concept, or you might call it a personality stability disposition that we have. Recent research has been conducted in this area by Shepard and Sig, and it focused on the relationship between self-esteem and musical preference. That will be evaluated further down in the presentation. But for now, we just need to have a basic understanding that when we talk about me, we're talking about the self component that is evaluated in terms of self-esteem. What is you? This has a tendency to be focused on in a negative manner, but it's only when we understand our views as individuals in terms of our self-esteem and our self-concept and our affiliations to in-groups and out-groups that we understand the differences between different groups and potential solutions that might arise when conflict comes between the two. Individuals always tend to categorize themselves in terms of their social interactions. This might be an affiliation to the United States military, or it might be a non-preferential choice, such as being male or female, or black or white, or any other number of things that is an automatic description, something that you didn't choose, but it's something that was chosen for you. It's something that we define ourselves by, but we have a tendency to gravitate towards others that share these same characteristics. Right or wrong, our in-groups always influence how we view our out-groups, and likewise, our out-groups also dictate how the in-group realm of friends or individuals that we hang around that have similar constructs, and their component is individuals, and that shapes the interactions between the two groups themselves. Further defining the social self, we turn to the research conducted by Schmidt, Houston, and Ramaya through their works in the theories in social psychology. They define social identity as being at the very heart of social psychological theory and research. One of the central theories involving social identity is widely known as self-categorization theory. This theory postulates that individuals tend to categorize their social interactions into in-group and out-group affiliations. An example of this would be that those that are commonly affiliated with the military and veterans, whether are actively serving or retired, tend to gravitate towards one another in the civilian sector regardless of their other in-group affiliations that they currently have, because of how strongly they feel and the attributions they have towards that particular in-group. Turner states that this is a natural human tendency to affiliate with some and not others. Further definition of this concept may be seen in one's categorization to a particular group, whether it's chosen or not. Two examples of this would be an occupation versus a gender or race. Some things that we do choose might be how we go about our days, what kind of cars we buy, what kind of clothes we wear. These things define us and our view of ourselves, and also the things that we cannot control. If we have a physical disability, or if we were born in a particular region of the world, where a race or a particular gender is looked down upon, these things do define us, and we cannot overlook those. Defining the reasons for this self-categorization is viewed in current research through the construct of salience, or to what degree an individual defines their self-concept in relation to a particular group or category. The self-concept is, at its root, connected to all social interaction, and thus will be woven into the preceding research analysis conducted throughout the following presentation. Moving into the social concept of the self in terms of who I am and me in evaluation, we look at self-esteem. Current research is being conducted on self-esteem and how it relates to the overall concept of the social self. And one of the most interesting facets of research being conducted in this day and age is the relationship between youth and their views toward music and how music influences their individual self-esteem. So, integral to the self-concept is the parallel construct of self-esteem, defined by Cass and Fien and Marcus, as we discussed before, an evaluative component of the self. Self-esteem, as we talked about, is a temporary formation, and it's not permanent. It can be changed, it can be altered contingent upon a myriad of factors. Recent research conducted by Daniel and Shepard, Nicola Sig, focused on the relationship between self-esteem and an individual's music preference. They hypothesized that individuals that prefer a particular type of music would naturally be expected to form affiliations and identify with a particular musical subgroup, thus impacting their self-esteem contingent upon their in-group affiliations. It would be natural and human to assume that those that play classical piano or enjoy the classical arts would affiliate themselves with others that enjoy the same types of music. The same as those that enjoy harder rock and or rap would affiliate with a separate in-group than those that associate themselves with a different genre. That being said, the results are very interesting in terms of what is expected in terms of the effects on self-esteem and also the self-concept. At the conclusion of their study, utilizing the Rosenberg self-esteem scales and the short test of music preference, they realized that there is a complex relationship between music preference and self-esteem. Even though the realm of social psychology is advancing daily, sometimes we lack current psychometric measures to measure exactly what we want to get at, exactly what we're trying to look at. So we are now able to theorize the inherent connection between the two, but because of the holes that were actually conducted in the experiment themselves, they weren't able to see quantitatively and quantifiably the massive impact that we know through common knowledge that music has in light of self-esteem, either anxious or depressive symptoms or elation of mood. These things are very difficult to describe and quantify. What's interesting, there was a quote at the beginning made by Steele and Brown, is that many young people in modern society consider music to be essential to their well-being. In this day and age, it is very hard to separate one's self-concept and from the musical identity they have. So interesting research conducted. It's not that the jury is completely out, but at this time, we just lack the current evaluative methods to thoroughly examine the complex relationship that exists between self-esteem and music. That being said, we still know that self-esteem plays a very vital role within the self-concept, and other methods and other research does indicate the dramatic relationship that various factors play on self-esteem, feeding into the self-concept as it is. Now that we've further clarified the me in terms of the social self, let's turn to the you. It's not one of those things that if you're not in, you're completely out. However, as human beings, we have a tendency to define things in terms of similarities or things that contrast with the groups that we currently have. Seen to the right-hand side of this slide, we see two humorous, but at the same time valid descriptions of various in-groups and out-groups. The top picture shows the Fellowship of the Ring and Lord of the Rings. This is the good guys in the group. It's a collective of hero-like characters that are moving through a fictitious land in order to accomplish a common task. They're working towards the betterment of something, but all the traits that they share, even though they're individuals, they're manifesting their relationships in a in-group in terms of fighting other out-groups seen in the lower picture. Mordor, Mount Doom, all of the bad, scary things in this movie are stereotypical out-group phenomenon. So you have the good guys on one side fighting the out-group on the other. But what makes these distinct, categorical, definable things? It all comes down to the social context they're expressed within. For instance, if we took and flip-flop the equation, if we looked solely from the bad guys' perspective, they would be the in-group and the Fellowship of the Ring would be the out-group. So it all depends on the saliency that you're evaluating the social situation from. Interesting to note, we talked about it before, is that groups may be freely chosen. It might be based on your occupation. If you're a doctor or a nurse, policeman, or a fireman, you're naturally going to gravitate towards people that share those same common characteristics. Those are where you're going to feel most comfortable, and it is a natural human tendency to form groups for survival. So in that, we're going to evaluate how stereotypes that we originally thought would be a good thing might be absolutely terrible depending on what your cause is and how they're attributed to your specific in-group, namely activists. So further developing the construct of the social self in connection with one's social environment, we're going to turn and look at in-group and out-group affiliations in an attempt to explain social behavior. Researcher Nadia Bashir and her colleagues conducted a study on this very concept, how it connects to activism in light of societal norms and out-group stereotypes. They explored very specific stereotypical beliefs and belief systems that are attributed to activists by constructing a series of studies that identified 30 of the most common character traits commonly ascribed to feminists and environmentalists. Their findings indicate that the majority of traits selected for stereotypical feminist and environmentalist behavior were negative in nature, most commonly describing those mentioned as militant and aggressive, man-hating, and eccentric and unconventional, unhygienic. They concluded that activism, in and of itself, should be a favorable thing. How is advocating for a worthy cause supposed to be negative? It's not. In fact, it's what we're called to do as Christians. However, according to the research they conducted, activism automatically lends itself to negative stereotyping. This is due to a myriad of factors. We can look at the very nature of activism in itself, of going against the grain, or taking your normal in-group that you feel comfortable with and moving to an out-group and going against the in-group phenomenology that you had before. In fact, the common characteristics described throughout this study are vehemently counterproductive to many activists, and it prohibits them from ultimately accomplishing their societal aspirations due to the stereotypes that are attributed to their behavior. How does this also interface with other in-groups and out-groups that are not environmentalists? We look at gender, at sexism, at racism, and these same stereotypical behaviors apply. We can't evaluate an in-group entirely based upon one individual's performance or a completely made-up scenario. We have to look at the actual truth. We can't take a stereotype and apply it in a generalized sense and expect to receive a positive result that is based on fact. So in-groups and out-groups influence our behavioral patterns and our societal interactions in a very, very big way. However, another interesting thing to note is that as we move through and develop our in-groups, our primary interactions serve as the baseline for behavior that we go off of. And it's very difficult to change that initial behavioral analogy or description that we attribute to someone. So if we see someone that we attribute as being slow or not as athletic, even though it might have been due to a completely different attributional process, it's very hard when evaluating that entire outgroup to not attribute that stereotype that we observed to the rest of the group. Now that we've evaluated the concept of the self, me, and you, we turn to the us and the we, the two individual words we use to describe a collective, not just individuals. So what is the purpose of all this? What is the purpose of understanding self-esteem, stereotypes, discrimination, prejudice, attributional process, and the self-concept? It is ultimately to improve the world. It is imperative now that we understand the inherent complex nature of the things we discussed in an attempt to go through and solve some of the world's problems. A theme running through many of successful interventions against stereotype threat effects is that the individuals feel a sense of trust and safety in the situation. That is, in the particular setting that they feel, they are not the target of others' low expectations and do not have to be concerned with unfairness or other obstacles that would otherwise distract, worry, or discourage them. This quote speaks so much about the current environment we live in right now. If we have learned as a society to trust others and value the safety of others, we may, in attempt, move past through different mental constructs and things that we can put into place to get our minds to shift from prejudice, discrimination, and stereotypes into evaluating behavioral on a different attributional plane to actually seeing the truth of an individual, to seeing them for who they are and getting down to the individual level of a problem. Evaluating the societal construct in terms of an individual and focusing on the individual behavioral patterns to ultimately shift the entire culture. A perfect example is this is seen in the phenomenon known as the jigsaw classroom. So different research was conducted looking at the average grade performance for different races of children within a particular classroom. And one of the potential solutions that was theorized and then put into practice was known as the jigsaw classroom. What they did was, instead of working with the entire class and having them raise hands and compete to answer questions, they would prescribe each student a buddy, and that buddy team would then learn a topic together and present it to the rest of the class. What they found as a result of this research project was that all of the grades collectively in the entire class rose. That was consistent across all races, and everyone that was in the entire study all benefited from this type of interaction, breaking down the cultural barriers by ascribing one individual to another, and forming and fostering these relationships in a group setting where there's a common goal, just like our reference to Lord of the Rings. In these types of relationships, there is a pressure to succeed, but it's to succeed together and not individually. Taking the anxiety out of the classroom by means of implementing things like this jigsaw program is just one of the ways that we can move forward as a society and as a collective for the betterment of all students, not just one particular in-group. Now that we've defined the social concept in its entirety in relation to different research, I leave you with two questions. How does being a child of God, a new creation, interface with our current in-group or our view of out-groups in relation to 2 Corinthians 5:17? Second, as Christians, as we walk as activists for the kingdom of heaven, how does our in-group affiliations impact our effectiveness in witnessing to others? If we feel called to advocate for the protection of God's creation through engaging in a rally with secular environmentalists, how do others correlate our Christianity to our activism in the context of our weekly research article by Nadia Bashir and her colleagues?